The funeral of Douglas Hartwell was supposed to be the final display of his family's power. At St. James Chapel, the city's wealthiest names filled the pews in black silk polished shoes and quiet whispers. Douglas Hartwell, the real estate titan who built a $280 million empire, lay in a silver-trimmed casket beneath white lilies. But his wife was not seated with the family. Cordelia Hartwell, 67 years old, the woman who had cared for Douglas through 22 years of marriage, sat near the back of the chapel in the row marked for guests. Meredith Hartwell Crane had arranged it herself. Douglas's eldest daughter stood in the front pew with her 3 siblings, her black dress perfect, her face dry, already imagining the boardroom where she would soon become CEO of Hartwell Properties. Then, just as the priest finished the final prayer, an old man rose from the 3rd row. Martin Ellsworth, Douglas Hartwell's private attorney for 35 years. Before Douglas is laid to rest, Ellsworth said, "I am legally required to carry out one final instruction from my client." The chapel went silent. Ellsworth opened his worn leather briefcase and removed not one document, but 3. The first is Mr. Hartwell's official will, he said. The second is an irrevocable trust created 18 years ago. Meredith's smile vanished. Ellsworth lifted the 3rd packet. And the last is a 12-page letter Douglas asked me to read aloud if his family tried to remove his wife from her rightful place. Cordelia stopped breathing, because for 22 years Douglas had only told her one thing. "Don't worry, my love, I've already taken care of everything." Now, in front of the family who had pushed her to the back row, she was about to find out what he meant. The morning of Douglas Hartwell's funeral arrived clear and cold. Sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of the small apartment where Cordelia Hartwell had lived for the last 8 years of her marriage. Most people never knew about the apartment. The newspapers photographed the Hartwell estate. The magazines photographed the penthouses. The business journals photographed the boardroom. But when Douglas wanted peace, he came here, a 2-bedroom apartment overlooking a small city park. No servants, no assistants, no board meetings, no children demanding something, just Douglas. And Cordelia! For 22 years she had shared his life. For 22 years his children had acted as though she were temporary. Today would be the first day she faced them without him. Cordelia stood before the bedroom mirror in silence. She was 67 years old now. Her silver hair was pinned carefully back. The black dress hanging against her frame was simple, elegant, and slightly old-fashioned. Douglas had loved that dress. "You look like yourself in that one," he had told her years ago. She touched the sleeve gently. Then she looked toward the frame photograph sitting on the dresser. Douglas, smiling, alive, still unaware that one day she would have to bury him. For a moment her composure almost broke. Almost. Then the doorbell rang. Maggie Chen entered carrying a small bouquet of white flowers. The 2 women had worked together as nurses decades ago. Maggie had watched Cordelia meet Douglas, watched her fall in love, watched her endure 22 years of insults from people who believed money gave them permission to be cruel. Maggie placed the flowers on the table. "You ready?" Cordelia smiled faintly. "Number?" Maggie nodded. "Good. Neither am I." That made Cordelia laugh softly for the first time in days. Maggie squeezed her hand. "They won't dare do anything today." Cordelia did not answer, because deep down she knew better. The drive to St. James Chapel took 20 minutes. The closer they got, the more expensive the cars became. Black sedans, luxury SUVs, private chauffeurs, television vans, reporters, security guards. Douglas Hartwell's funeral looked less like a funeral and more like a corporate merger. The church itself rose above the street in pale stone and stained glass. People stood outside, speaking quietly. Executives, politicians, developers, investors, people who wanted to be seen mourning a powerful man. Maggie parked. The 2 women stepped out. Immediately, Cordelia felt it. The way conversations softened, the way eyes followed her. Not because she was the widow, because she was the second wife. The gold digger, the nurse, the mistake. At least that was how the Hartwell children had described her for years. They had repeated it often enough that strangers believed it. Cordelia and Maggie had almost reached the chapel entrance when a man in a black suit stepped into their path. Early 40s. Bluetooth earpiece. Clipboard. Professional smile. Meredith's assistant. Mrs. Hartwell. Cordelia nodded. The man glanced down at his notes. Mrs. Hartwell Crane has arranged seating assignments. Maggie immediately frowned. Seating assignments. The man ignored her. There's a reserved section available for you in the guest area. Cordelia stared at him. Guest area? Yes, ma'am. The smile remained. Polite. Cold. Practiced. Family seating is reserved. For a second, nobody spoke. Even the noise around them seemed to fade. Maggie stepped forward. This is Douglas Hartwell's wife. The assistant lowered his voice. I'm simply following instructions. Maggie looked ready to continue. Cordelia gently touched her arm. It's all right. No, it isn't. It's today, Cordelia said softly. Let it be today. The assistant visibly relaxed. That hurt more than the insult itself. He had expected a fight. He had prepared for one. Instead, the widow simply nodded and walked past him, as if humiliation had become something familiar. Inside the chapel, the divide was obvious. The first rows were reserved for family. The Hartwell name was printed on small cards placed neatly across the front pews. Meredith sat in the center. Perfect posture. Perfect makeup. Perfect grief. To her right sat Bradford. Expensive watch. Expressionless face. Already checking messages on his phone whenever he thought nobody was looking. To her left sat Genevieve. Quiet. Uncomfortable. Her eyes fixed on the floor. At the far end sat Spencer, late, sunglasses still hanging from his collar, looking annoyed rather than heartbroken. The future heirs. At least they believed they were. Cordelia was escorted all the way to the final guest section near the back. The last row, as far from the family as possible without leaving the building. She sat down quietly, Maggie beside her. No protest. No tears. No scene, only dignity. The organ music began. People rose. The casket entered. And for the first time that day, Cordelia looked directly at Douglas. The room disappeared. The reporters disappeared. The Hartwell children disappeared. There was only the man she had loved. The man who used to bring her coffee every Sunday morning. The man who hated neckties. The man who had once taken her hand and whispered, "Don't worry about them. I've already taken care of everything." The memory struck her unexpectedly. Taken care of everything. What had he meant? She had asked him once. He had only smiled. Now he was gone, and she still did not know. The service continued. Scripture, music, speeches, polite grief, corporate grief, the kind that sounded impressive and meant very little. Then it happened. Genevieve turned, only briefly. Just one glance. Her eyes met Cordelia's. Something passed between them. Regret. Shame. Maybe even apology. Genevieve opened her mouth slightly, as if she wanted to say something. As if she had wanted to say it for years. Then Meredith noticed. Without turning her head, she reached out and gripped her sister's wrist. Hard. Don't, Meredith whispered. Genevieve immediately lowered her eyes. The moment vanished. But Cordelia had seen it, and once something is seen, it cannot be unseen. The priest stepped forward for the final prayer. The chapel grew silent, heads bowed. The service was ending. The family believed the next chapter of Hartwell Properties was about to begin. Cordelia believed she would go home alone. Neither of them knew Douglas Hartwell had arranged one final meeting. The priest closed the Bible. Amen? The congregation echoed the word. Then a chair scraped against the stone floor. An elderly man stood from the third row, silver hair, bent shoulders, dark suit, worn leather briefcase. Martin Ellsworth, Douglas Hartwell's attorney for 35 years. The old lawyer walked slowly toward the podium. The room watched in confusion. He set the briefcase down, opened it, and removed a thick stack of documents. When he looked up, his eyes settled briefly on Cordelia. Then on Meredith, then on the casket. Finally he spoke. Before Douglas Hartwell is laid to rest, he said, I have a legal obligation to carry out his final instruction. The chapel fell completely silent. Martin Ellsworth stood at the front of St. James Chapel with Douglas Hartwell's casket behind him and 3 stacks of paper in his hands. The congregation did not move. Not at first. There was a particular kind of silence that belonged only to powerful families when something unexpected happened in public. It was not grief. It was calculation. Meredith Hartwell Crane stood in the front pew, one hand still resting on the polished wood in front of her. Her expression had hardened into the look Cordelia had seen too many times across too many dinner tables. Control, that was Meredith's first instinct. Control the room, control the message, control the widow. But Martin Ellsworth had not worked for Douglas Hartwell for 35 years because he was easily controlled. He adjusted his glasses, opened the first document, and looked toward the casket. Douglas Hartwell left specific instructions, he said. These instructions were to be carried out before his burial in the presence of his family, his wife, and the witnesses gathered here today. A low murmur passed through the chapel. Cordelia sat in the last row, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Maggie leaned closer. Cordelia, she whispered, did you know about this? Cordelia shook her head once. Number. She did not know. That frightened her more than if she had. Ellsworth began with the official will. The language was formal. Careful. Expected. Douglas's personal residences outside the marital apartment were to be divided among his 4 children. His private art collection would be placed into a family trust. Several vehicles, investment accounts, and personal holdings were distributed equally. Meredith slowly sat down. Bradford's shoulders relaxed. Spencer leaned back as though bored again. Even Genevieve seemed to breathe for the first time since Ellsworth had stood. It sounded for a moment exactly like what they had expected. Cordelia listened without expression. She had not married Douglas for houses. She had not sat beside his hospital bed for investment accounts. She had not held his hand through 22 years of blood pressure readings, medication schedules, boardroom betrayals, and late-night regrets because she was waiting for a number to be read from a page. Still, it hurt. Not because she wanted more, because the will sounded like a world where she had never existed. Then Ellsworth stopped. The chapel seemed to notice the pause before the family did. Meredith lifted her chin. Is that all? Ellsworth looked at her. Number. 1 word. Flat. Final. He turned a page. The official will address as Mr. Hartwell's personal property, he said. However, there is one matter this will does not address. Bradford frowned. Ellsworth continued, because that matter was resolved 18 years ago. The air changed. Cordelia felt Maggie's hand close around hers. 18 years ago. The number moved through Cordelia like a door opening somewhere deep in the past. 18 years ago, Douglas had still been strong. 53, sharp-eyed, restless, still capable of walking into a room and making men twice as loud fall silent. 18 years ago, she remembered him coming home late from a bored dinner standing in the apartment kitchen without removing his coat. He had not spoken for almost a minute. Then he had crossed the room, taken both her hands, and said, Promise me something, Cordelia. What? When the time comes, don't argue with them. She had frowned. With who? He had only kissed her forehead. With anyone who tries to tell you who you were to me. At the time, she thought he had been tired. Now Martin Ellsworth was opening the second document, and Cordelia understood that Douglas had not been tired. He had been planning. The chapel faded for a moment. 18 years earlier, Douglas Hartwell sat in Martin Ellsworth's private office with his suit jacket over the chair and his tie loosened at the throat. The office smelled of old leather oak shelves and rain against the windows. Ellsworth placed a thick legal packet in front of him. Douglas, he said quietly, once this is executed, it cannot be casually undone. That is the point. You understand Cordelia will not know. She cannot know, Douglas said. Ellsworth studied him. Most men would tell their wives. Douglas looked toward the rain-dark glass. Most men do not have children like mine. He had heard them 2 nights before, Meredith and Bradford in the side hall of the Hartwell estate speaking because they believed he had already gone upstairs. She won't last, Meredith had said. Women like Cordelia never do. Bradford had laughed. The nurse, please. Dad is infatuated. It'll pass, and if it doesn't, we manage her later. Douglas had stood in the shadow of the hall and listened, not angry. Worse. Clear. That night something in him settled. The next morning he called Ellsworth. Now in that office he picked up the pen. I built Hartwell Properties from nothing, Douglas said. My children were raised inside the finished house. They have no memory of the foundation being poured. Ellsworth said nothing. Douglas signed the first page. Then the second. Then the third. When I was sick, Cordelia sat beside me before she loved me. She knew me when I was afraid. They only knew me when I was useful. He turned another page. I want everything protected. From creditors. Douglas looked at him. From blood. Ellsworth went still. Douglas signed again. Cordelia will not carry this secret, he said. She has carried enough from my family. If I tell her, she will spend the rest of my life worrying. I do not want that. The pen moved across the final signature line. I want her to live peacefully until the day they make peace impossible. The memory dissolved. Back in St. James Chapel, Ellsworth lifted the second document where everyone could see it. This is an irrevocable trust agreement executed on November 7, 2006, he said. It was witness notarized, recorded, and accompanied by video confirmation of Mr. Hartwell's competency and intent. Meredith was already standing. Number. Ellsworth did not stop. The trust transferred 67% of the controlling shares of Hartwell Properties into an entity known as the Cordelia Trust. The murmur that followed was no longer soft. Bradford stood so quickly his program fell to the floor. Spencer removed his sunglasses from his collar. Genevieve covered her mouth. Cordelia did not move. She could not. Ellsworth looked toward the last row. The sole beneficiary of that trust is Mrs. Cordelia Hartwell. The words reached her slowly, as if they had to cross 22 years of insults to find her. Cordelia Hartwell. Not guest. Not nurse. Not gold digger. Beneficiary. Owner. Wife. Meredith stepped into the aisle. This is forged. Her voice was too loud for a chapel. Several people turned. She did not care. My father would never transfer controlling interest without telling his children. Ellsworth closed the trust packet halfway. Your father anticipated that response. Meredith's face flushed. Do not speak to me like that. Ellsworth's voice remained calm. Mrs. Hartwell Crane, the trust was created while your father was fully competent. It contains witness signatures, notarization board disclosures sealed under attorney privilege, and a video record of execution. Bradford snapped, show it. Ellsworth looked at him. If required in court, I will. That silenced him. Not because he believed it, because men like Bradford understood liability faster than truth. Cordelia's hands trembled on her lap. Maggie held them tighter. You knew, Maggie whispered. Cordelia's voice barely came. Number. Across the chapel, Genevieve turned again. This time, Meredith did not stop her fast enough. Genevieve's eyes met Cordelia's. There was shock there, but also something else. Not anger, not even fear. Relief! As if a quiet part of her had been waiting for proof that her father had seen what the rest of them had refused to name. Ellsworth set the trust document down on the podium. Then he reached for the third packet. It was thinner than the trust. 12 pages. Cream paper, handwritten, bound with a simple black clip. The chapel went still in a different way now, because legal documents could be challenged, numbers could be argued, signatures could be attacked, but a letter from a dead man was harder to dismiss. Ellsworth held it gently as if the pages still carried the weight of Douglas's hand. There is one final document, he said. Meredith shook her head. No more? But her voice no longer commanded the room. Ellsworth looked toward the casket. Douglas asked that this letter be read aloud if his family attempted to diminish Cordelia's place before or during his funeral. Every eye moved to the last row, to Cordelia, to the widow they had seated with guests. Cordelia felt the room turn toward her, but she kept looking at Ellsworth. He opened the first page. His voice softened. These are Douglas Hartwell's own words. Then he read the first line. My children will ask why I did this. Let them ask. I have been waiting 18 years to answer. Martin Ellsworth held the 12-page letter with both hands. For a moment he did not read. He simply stood there beneath the stained glass light of St. James Chapel, an old lawyer with white hair and bent shoulders, holding the last words of a man who had built an empire and waited 18 years to explain why he had taken it out of his children's hands. No one in the chapel moved. Cordelia sat in the last row with Maggie beside her, her fingers locked together so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Meredith stood frozen in the front pew. Bradford leaned forward, jaw clenched. Genevieve stared at the floor with tears already gathering in her eyes. Spencer no longer looked bored. The sunglasses were still hanging from his collar, but his hand had moved toward them without quite touching them, as if for the first time that morning he needed to see clearly. Ellsworth lowered his eyes to the page. Then he began, "My children will ask why I did this. Let them ask. I have been waiting 18 years to answer." The first pages were not accusations. That was what made them worse. Douglas wrote about the beginning. He wrote about a rented desk in the back of a failing insurance office, about driving from the neighborhood to neighborhood in an old brown pickup looking at empty lots nobody wanted, about borrowing against everything he owned to buy his first parcel of land. He wrote about sleeping on a cot in a construction trailer because he could not afford both rent and payroll. He wrote about the first building Hartwell Properties ever finished, a plain brick apartment complex with leaky windows and uneven stairs, and how proud he had been because every worker had been paid on time. Ellsworth's voice was steady, not dramatic, not angry. That made every word feel like record, not memory, evidence. "I built Hartwell Properties before there was a Hartwell family name worth protecting," Douglas had written. "I built it before my children knew what a balance sheet was. I built it when the only thing I owned was debt and stubbornness." The congregation listened. Some had known Douglas only as a wealthy man. They had forgotten or never cared to know that wealth had once been work. Meredith's face did not change, but her hand tightened around the back of the pew. Then Ellsworth turned to the fourth page. The letter shifted. "My children were not born cruel," he read. That would be easier to say. But ease is not truth. They were born loved. They were given comfort. They were given education. They were given access. And somewhere along the way, some of them began to confuse inheritance with achievement. A ripple moved through the chapel. Bradford muttered something under his breath. Ellsworth did not stop. He read Meredith's name first. "My daughter Meredith has always possessed a brilliant mind. She can read a contract faster than most attorneys can draft one. But brilliance without mercy becomes a knife. I watched her learn how to cut people while keeping her gloves clean." Meredith's face flushed. Ellsworth continued, "In 2006, I heard Meredith say Cordelia was temporary. Not a wife, not family, temporary. She said this in my house beneath my roof, while the woman she insulted was in the kitchen preparing tea for a man she had just helped survive another cardiac episode." Cordelia closed her eyes. She remembered that night. She remembered the tea. She remembered Douglas standing unusually quiet in the hallway afterward. She had asked if he was tired. He had said yes. Now she understood. He had not been tired. He had been grieving what he had heard. Ellsworth turned the page. "My son Bradford understands money as appetite. He knows how to take dividends, how to inflate management fees, how to dress greed in corporate language. But he does not understand stewardship. He has never left a dollar alone long enough to let it become something useful." Bradford stood. "This is absurd." His voice cracked through the chapel. Several people gasped. Ellsworth looked up. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, "your father specifically instructed that every person named in this letter remain present until it has been read in full." Bradford laughed without humor. "He's dead." Ellsworth's eyes did not move. "Yes," he said, "and this is his final instruction." The chapel held its breath. Bradford looked toward Meredith, expecting support. Meredith did not look at him. Slowly, humiliatingly, Bradford sat down, like a boy being corrected in front of strangers. Ellsworth resumed, "My daughter Genevieve has a good heart buried beneath fear. I have seen her kindness. I have also seen her silence. Silence does less damage than cruelty, but it still lets cruelty work." Genevieve covered her mouth. A tear slipped down her face. Cordelia looked at her from the last row. For the first time in 22 years, she saw not one of Douglas's children, but a frightened woman who had spent her life letting stronger voices decide what was safe to feel. Then came Spencer. My youngest son Spencer has been forgiven so often that he mistakes forgiveness for income. I love him. That is not the same as trusting him. A man who treats every door as an exit cannot be handed the keys to what others built. Spencer slowly removed his sunglasses from his collar. He did not put them on. He folded them in both hands and stared at the floor. For once his eyes were visible, and they looked younger than 38. Ellsworth paused before turning to page 7. His voice softened. Now I will speak of my wife. The word wife moved through the chapel like a correction. Not nurse. Not second wife. Not gold digger. Wife. Cordelia lowered her head. Maggie squeezed her hand. Douglas's words continued. Cordelia came to me when I was not powerful, not in the way people imagine power. I had money then, yes. I had buildings. I had employees. But when she first cared for me, I was a frightened man in a hospital bed, bargaining with my own heart to keep beating. The chapel was silent now in a different way, less curious, more ashamed. She did not ask what I was worth. She asked if I had eaten. She did not ask what I owned. She asked if I had slept. She did not want my company. She wanted me alive. Cordelia pressed one hand to her mouth. Ellsworth's voice trembled for the first time. She did not need my money. She needed me to live. That sentence did what no legal document had done. It broke the lie. For 22 years, the Hartwell children had called Cordelia a woman who married for money. And now Douglas Hartwell from the grave had answered them in the only courtroom they could not control, a church full of witnesses. Cordelia did not cry loudly. She made no sound. But tears slid down her face, and she let them. Because for the first time since Douglas died, she was not defending her love alone. He was defending it for her. Ellsworth read pages 8 and 9. Douglas wrote of the apartment, of Sunday mornings, of Cordelia reminding him to take his medication before board meetings, of the way she remembered the names of construction workers, janitors, drivers, and receptionists long after his executives forgot them. He wrote of the night she fell asleep in a chair beside his bed, with one hand still resting on his wrist, counting the rhythm of his pulse in her sleep. I have watched my children measure Cordelia by what they fear she might receive, he wrote. I have measured her by what she gave when there was no guarantee of return. Meredith's eyes glittered with anger, but no one came to her defense. Then Ellsworth reached the final pages. The pages where Douglas stopped remembering and began deciding. My children will be provided for, he read. I have not abandoned them, but they will not control what they did not build, what they did not protect, and what they never respected. Bradford stared straight ahead. Spencer wiped his face quickly and looked away. Genevieve was openly crying now. Meredith remained rigid, but something had gone wrong in her expression. The certainty had cracked. The controlling interest in Hartwell Properties belongs to the Cordelia Trust. It has belonged there for 18 years. This was not an impulse. This was not illness. This was not manipulation. This was my decision as a man of sound mind, clear memory, and full knowledge of the people around me. Ellsworth turned the final page. Cordelia felt the entire chapel leaning toward the words, If my children are angry, let them be angry at me. If they are ashamed, let them ask why. But if they try to remove Cordelia from her rightful place beside me, let this letter be read where they cannot pretend they did not hear it. Meredith looked toward the back row then. Not at the guests, not at the reporters, at Cordelia. For the first time that morning she looked at her as if she had weight, presence, power. Ellsworth read the last paragraph. Cordelia was my wife. She was my witness. She was my shelter. And she is the only person I trust to protect the thing I spent my life building. He lowered the page. The sound of paper settling in his hands seemed louder than the organ had been. No one spoke. No one coughed. No one shifted. The chapel that had seated Cordelia in the last row now turned toward her as if the whole room had been rearranged without anyone standing. She had become visible, not because she had demanded it, because Douglas had named her. Ellsworth carefully folded the letter. "That is all Douglas Hartwell wished me to read." He looked directly at Meredith. "And now, Mrs. Hartwell Crane, I believe there is something you may wish to say to Mrs. Cordelia Hartwell." Meredith did not move. Cordelia did not look away. For 22 years, Meredith had spoken about her as if she were not in the room. Now the room waited to hear whether she could speak to her at all. The funeral ended, but no one left. That was the first sign that Douglas Hartwell's final instruction had done exactly what he intended. People stood in the aisles of St. James Chapel as if the service had ended too quickly for their minds to catch up. Executives whispered near the side doors. Reporters pretended not to listen while listening to everything. Old family friends stood with programs folded in their hands, glancing from the casket to the last row, where Cordelia Hartwell still sat beside Maggie Chen. Cordelia did not move at first. She remained where Meredith had placed her. The last row. The guest section. But the meaning of that seat had changed. An hour earlier it had been an insult. Now everyone in the chapel understood it as evidence. Douglas had said in 12 pages of his own handwriting that if his family tried to diminish his wife before or during his funeral, the letter was to be read aloud. And they had done exactly that. Maggie leaned close. "Cordelia," she whispered, "breathe." Cordelia realized she had been holding her breath. She inhaled slowly. Across the chapel, Meredith Hartwell Crane turned away from the aisle with the rigid movement of a woman barely containing herself. She caught Bradford's arm, snapped her fingers toward Spencer, and looked once at Genevieve. "Family room," she said. It was not an invitation. It was an order. Bradford followed immediately, red-faced and furious. Spencer hesitated, still holding his sunglasses in one hand, then followed because leaving alone would require a decision. Genevieve stood last. Before she turned, she looked back at Cordelia. The same look from earlier. Shame. But now there was something else inside it, a question. Then Meredith said sharper, "Genevieve." Genevieve lowered her eyes and followed. The private family room was tucked behind the chapel office, a small space used for mourners who needed privacy before burial. It had pale wallpaper, a round table, and a framed watercolor of St. James in spring. Meredith shut the door so hard the frame shook. "Absolutely not," she said. Bradford paced the room. "Tell me we can overturn it." Spencer dropped into a chair. "Can someone explain how Dad gave away the company 18 years ago and nobody noticed?" Meredith spun on him. "He did not give it away. He was manipulated." Genevieve stood near the wall, arms wrapped tightly around herself. "That's not what the documents said." Meredith turned slowly. "What?" Genevieve swallowed. "I said that's not what the documents said." Bradford stopped pacing. Meredith stared at her sister as if she had spoken in a foreign language. "You are not seriously accepting this." "I'm saying Dad made a decision. Dad was grieving. Dad was aging. Dad was influenced by her." Genevieve's face changed at the word her. For 22 years, Cordelia had been reduced to pronouns in Hartwell rooms. Her. That woman. The nurse. Temporary. The mistake. But Douglas had just named her wife in front of half the city. Genevieve lifted her head. Dad signed the trust 18 years ago. He was 53. He was not dying. He was not confused. And Martin said there's video. Meredith stepped toward her. "You think Martin Ellsworth is untouchable? Trusts can be challenged. Witnesses can be questioned. Competency can be attacked. We can bury that woman in litigation until she sells just to breathe." Bradford nodded. "That's the first sensible thing anyone has said." Genevieve looked at him. "You heard the letter." "I heard theater," Bradford snapped. "No," Genevieve said, and her voice was quiet enough that they almost missed the strength inside it. "You heard Dad." The room went still. Meredith's expression hardened. "Whose side are you on?" Genevieve looked frightened, but she did not look away. "I am not on Cordelia's side." Meredith exhaled sharply, almost satisfied. Then Genevieve finished. "I'm on Dad's." The words landed with more force than shouting. Bradford stared at her. Spencer sat up. Meredith looked as if her sister had struck her. "You ungrateful little coward," Meredith whispered. Genevieve's eyes filled, but she did not back down. Maybe I was a coward, she said. Maybe that's why he wrote what he wrote about me. Maybe he was right. Meredith's hand curled around the edge of the table. Genevieve continued. But I am not going to pretend he didn't see us. He saw us, Meredith. He heard us. He made that trust because of what we became. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Meredith laughed once, low and bitter. If you want to be noble, do it on your own time. I am going to protect this family. Genevieve said no. You're going to protect control. Meredith opened her mouth, but no answer came. Outside in the chapel hall, Cordelia stood near a side window while the funeral guests slowly moved around her in uneasy circles. No one quite knew how to approach her now. Some nodded. Some looked away. A few offered condolences in softer voices than before, as if their respect had arrived late and was embarrassed by its own timing. Maggie stood beside her like a guard. If one more person says, "I'm so sorry," like they weren't staring at you an hour ago, I may forget I'm a retired nurse and become a public menace. Cordelia almost smiled. Almost. Then Martin Ellsworth approached. He had put the documents back into his worn leather briefcase, but he still carried the 12-page letter in a separate folder against his chest. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. Cordelia turned. For the first time that day, the name did not feel like something others were trying to take from her. "Martin?" Ellsworth's eyes softened. "I owe you an apology." "No," Cordelia said. "You carried out Douglas's wishes." "I did, but I also kept you in the dark for 18 years. Cordelia looked through the side window. Outside, pallbearers were preparing to move Douglas's casket toward the hearse. White lilies trembled in the cold air. "Did he ask you to—" "Yes." "Then you kept your promise to him." Ellsworth lowered his head. "He wanted you to live without the weight of it." Cordelia closed her eyes. That hurt more than she expected. Not because she was angry, because it was exactly the sort of thing Douglas would do. Carry the fear himself. Leave her the peace, even if the peace had always been temporary. "I don't know anything about running a company," she said. Ellsworth did not answer too quickly. That was one reason Douglas had trusted him. "I know." Cordelia turned toward him. "I was a nurse, Martin. I know medication schedules. I know how to read a pulse. I know when someone is pretending they're not in pain. I do not know acquisitions board votes, debt structures, or development deals." Ellsworth smiled faintly. Douglas knew that too. Cordelia gave him a tired look. "That is not comforting." "It should be." He opened his briefcase and removed a smaller packet. "Douglas did not make you CEO. He did not expect you to sit behind his desk and do what Meredith wanted to do. He created the Cordelia Trust to give you control over what matters." He placed the packet in her hands. "Veto authority over any sale. Appointment rights for 2 independent board seats. Approval power over debt exceeding a fixed threshold. Protection from forced liquidation. And permanent residence rights to the apartment and any marital property Douglas designated separately." Cordelia stared at the documents. The words blurred slightly. Not because she did not understand them, because she understood enough. Douglas had not handed her an empire and left her alone inside it. He had built a fence around the empire and placed her at the gate. Ellsworth said quietly, "He did not need you to run Hartwell Properties. He needed you to protect it from the people who would sell it for applause." Cordelia looked out the window again. The casket was being carried down the chapel steps. Douglas's children were still inside fighting. His wife stood behind glass, holding the protection he had written before any of them knew there would be a funeral like this. The hearse door opened. Cordelia placed one hand against the window, cold glass beneath her palm. "Douglas," she whispered too softly for anyone but Maggie and Ellsworth to hear. "I don't know if I can do this." Maggie touched her shoulder. "Ellsworth said he believed you could." Cordelia watched the casket slide into the hearse. Then she remembered the apartment, the quiet mornings, the way Douglas used to stand behind her while she made tea and rest his chin on her shoulder. The way he once told her after a terrible dinner with his children, "You think kindness is soft? Because cruel people taught you that. It isn't. Kindness survives longer." Cordelia lowered her hand from the glass. Her back straightened. "Then I'll do it," she said. Ellsworth nodded once. Good. The door to the private family room opened. Meredith came out first. Her face was composed again, but not peaceful. She had rebuilt her mask quickly, and that made her more dangerous, not less. Bradford followed behind her. Spencer lingered near the doorway. Genevieve came last, pale and shaken. Meredith walked directly toward Cordelia. The people in the hall noticed. Conversation faded. Maggie stepped half a pace forward. Cordelia gently stopped her. Meredith halted 2 feet away. For 22 years she had spoken to Cordelia with the effortless cruelty of someone certain the room belonged to her. Now the room was watching. "You think you won?" Meredith said. Cordelia looked at her. "Number." Meredith's mouth tightened. "You don't know this world. You don't know the board. You don't know lenders, buyers, developers, legal pressure, shareholder strategy. My father handed you a weapon you don't even know how to hold." Cordelia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Maybe." Meredith blinked. It was not the answer she expected. Cordelia continued, "Maybe I will make mistakes. Maybe I will need help. Maybe I will fail at things you understand better than I do." A small smile touched Meredith's face. Then Cordelia finished, "But if I fail, Meredith, it will be my failure, not yours to arrange." The smile disappeared. Cordelia stepped closer. "And whatever I do from this day forward, I will do it from the place your father gave me, not from the last row where you put me." The hall went silent. Meredith looked as though she might answer. But for the first time in 22 years, Cordelia did not lower her eyes. And Meredith had no practiced line for a widow who had finally become visible. For 7 days after Douglas Hartwell's funeral, Cordelia did not return to the Hartwell estate. She stayed in the apartment. The small 2-bedroom apartment with the park across the street, the narrow kitchen Douglas had loved more than any dining room in any mansion, and the worn blue armchair where he used to fall asleep with financial reports open on his lap. By Monday morning, the apartment had become something else. Not a home, not exactly an office, a quiet headquarters. The kitchen table was covered with documents, trust papers, board structures, ownership charts, shareholder agreements, old meeting minutes, copies of signatures, letters from Douglas. A laptop sat beside a teapot. Yellow sticky notes marked pages Cordelia still did not fully understand. Maggie had cleared one corner of the table for meals and defended that corner like territory in a war. "You are going to eat," Maggie said on the first morning. Cordelia looked up from a document labeled Voting Rights and Transfer Restrictions. "I'm not hungry." "I did not ask if you were hungry." Cordelia stared at her. Maggie placed a bowl of soup in front of her. "I spent 30 years keeping people alive in a hospital. Do not test me." Cordelia ate. Martin Ellsworth arrived every morning at 9. He brought files in a brown leather briefcase, the same briefcase he had carried into St. James Chapel. He took off his coat, accepted tea from Maggie, and sat across from Cordelia like a patient teacher. He never rushed her. That mattered. Meredith had always spoken to Cordelia as if she were slow. Bradford had spoken as if she were invisible. Spencer had rarely spoken at all unless he needed something. But Martin Ellsworth explained things as Douglas had clearly, carefully, without condescension. "This is the trust structure," he said on Tuesday, turning a page toward her. "You do not own the company personally. The Cordelia Trust holds controlling interest. You are the sole beneficiary with protective authority built into the trust terms." Cordelia touched the margin of the page. "So I can't simply sell it." "Number." "Good." Ellsworth looked at her over his glasses. Most people, upon learning they controlled 67% of a real estate company worth hundreds of millions, would ask what they could cash out. Cordelia had asked what she could prevent. Douglas had known her well. Ellsworth continued, "You have veto authority over any major sale, merger, leveraged financing, or transfer of core assets. You may appoint 2 independent board members. You may require review of executive compensation. You may block asset liquidation." Cordelia absorbed each sentence slowly, not because she lacked intelligence, because she respected weight. A nurse knew that some mistakes could not be undone. The wrong dosage, the missed symptom, the pulse you failed to check. Now she was learning that money had its own vital signs. Debt, equity, control, liquidity. She wrote the words in a notebook Douglas had once used for grocery lists. Maggie watched from the kitchen, drying the same teacup for far too long. "You look like you're studying for a medical board exam," she said. Cordelia did not look up. "In a way, I am." Ellsworth smiled. "A board exam. Very good." Across town, Meredith Hartwell Crane had turned grief into litigation. By Tuesday afternoon, 3 law firms had reviewed the Cordelia Trust. By Wednesday, 2 had withdrawn from further challenge. By Thursday morning, the most aggressive firm in the city had assigned 6 attorneys to find a weakness in the structure Douglas had built 18 years earlier. They found none. The signatures were clean. The witnesses were alive or properly recorded. The video confirmation showed Douglas Hartwell at 53, clear-eyed and impatient, answering competency questions with the dry irritation of a man who thought the obvious should not need repeating. No sign of coercion, no sign of incapacity, no missing disclosure, no procedural flaw. The trust had been funded properly, recorded properly, protected properly. Every door Meredith's attorneys tried to open led to another lock Douglas had installed before they arrived. By Friday, Meredith sat at the head of a glass conference table with 6 legal pads, 9 binders, and a level of silence she could not intimidate into changing. One attorney finally said what the others had avoided. "Mrs. Hartwell Crane, the trust is extraordinarily difficult to attack." Meredith's eyes narrowed. "Difficult is not impossible." "No," the attorney said carefully, "but in this case, difficult may mean financially irrational and reputationally damaging." Bradford leaned back in his chair. "English." The attorney folded his hands. "Your father did this correctly." Meredith looked at him as if he had betrayed her personally. He hid it. He protected it. The distinction cut through the room. For the first time since the funeral, Meredith had no immediate answer, because that was the truth she could not sue. Cordelia had not beaten her. Not yet. Martin Ellsworth had not beaten her. Not really. Douglas had. 18 years ago. On Saturday afternoon, the apartment buzzer rang. Maggie was in the kitchen making tea. Ellsworth had gone home for the day after leaving Cordelia with 3 pages of questions to review before Monday. Cordelia sat alone at the table, reading a clause about restricted share transfers when the buzzer sounded again. Maggie frowned. "Were you expecting someone?" "Number." Maggie moved toward the intercom. A male voice came through the speaker. "It's Spencer." Cordelia and Maggie looked at each other. Maggie pressed the button. "Spencer, who?" A pause. "Hartwell." Maggie said, "I know. I wanted to hear you say it." Cordelia gave her a look. Maggie shrugged. "What, he can wait 3 seconds." Cordelia stood. "Let him up." Spencer arrived without a lawyer. That was the first surprise. The second was that he wore no sunglasses. The third was that he looked tired. Not theatrical tired, not hungover, though he may have been that too. Tired in the way of someone who had spent a week discovering that money could vanish before he ever touched it. He stood awkwardly inside the doorway, looking around the apartment. Cordelia saw him seeing it. The small table, the old sofa, the framed photograph of Douglas beside the lamp. The absence of gold, the absence of anything worth stealing. "You lived here?" he asked. Cordelia closed the door. "Yes." "With Dad?" "Yes." Spencer seemed unsettled by that, as if his father's life had contained rooms the children had never entered. Maggie crossed her arms. "You want tea?" Spencer blinked. "Number." "Good. I wasn't offering." Cordelia said Maggie. Maggie lifted both hands and retreated to the kitchen, but not far. Spencer sat on the edge of the sofa only after Cordelia gestured for him to. For a few seconds he said nothing. Then he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "I don't want a war." Cordelia sat across from him. "That makes one of you." He flinched slightly. "Not because it was cruel, because it was accurate." "I don't care about the company," he said. "I know." That surprised him. Cordelia continued. "Your father knew too." Spencer looked down. There it was again. That small wounded confusion he had shown in the chapel after hearing Douglas's letter. The look of a man who had built his entire life around disappointing people before they could expect anything from him. "I just want my money," he said. Maggie muttered from the kitchen. Finally, an honest Hartwell. Cordelia ignored her. "How How much money? My share. Of what? Spencer rubbed his face. The 33%. Whatever portion is mine. 25% of that, I guess. Meredith says we shouldn't sell anything, but Meredith also says a lot of things before deciding everyone agrees with her. Cordelia watched him carefully. Why come to me alone? Because Meredith wants a fight. Bradford wants leverage. Genevieve. He stopped. Genevieve, what? He shook his head. I don't know what Genevieve wants anymore. And you... Spencer looked around the apartment again, then at Douglas's photograph. I want out before everyone starts pretending this is about Dad. That was the first mature thing Cordelia had ever heard him say. She stood and crossed to the kitchen table. From a folder Ellsworth had prepared days earlier, because Douglas had anticipated even this, she removed a simple agreement. She brought it back and placed it on the coffee table. Your father allowed for voluntary buyouts of minority interests under specific conditions, she said. Spencer stared at her. He did. Yes, of course he did. Cordelia almost smiled. The trust may purchase your personal share at fair market value subject to independent valuation. You will receive what it is worth, not what Meredith tells you to demand, not what Bradford thinks he can inflate. What it is worth. Spencer picked up the first page. What's the catch? You sign a full release. You surrender any future claim against the trust. You cannot participate in litigation against it. And you do not return later asking for more. He looked at the document, then at her. You really don't want to punish us. Cordelia sat back down. Spencer, punishment would require me to organize my life around your behavior. I have already given the Hartwell children 22 years. I am not giving you the rest. For once, he had no sarcastic answer. He read the agreement. Not well, probably. Not deeply, but enough to understand the door in front of him. Then he picked up the pen. Maggie came out of the kitchen. You don't want a lawyer? Spencer said, if I bring a lawyer, Meredith will know before sunset. If Meredith knows, she'll turn this into another family loyalty test. I'm tired. He signed. His handwriting was loose, uneven, almost careless. But the signature was real, Spencer Hartwell. The first child to leave the war. When he finished, he set the pen down and looked at Cordelia with something that might have been embarrassment. Did he hate me? The question was so quiet, Maggie stopped moving. Cordelia looked at Douglas's youngest son. For all his waste and selfishness, he was still the boy Douglas had once carried on his shoulders. Still the child who had lost his mother too young and grown up in a house where money had replaced repair. No, she said. Spencer swallowed. He should have. Maybe, but he didn't. Spencer stood quickly, as if kindness made him more uncomfortable than accusation. At the door, he paused. Meredith will come harder now. I know. She thinks if she can scare you, you'll fold. Cordelia opened the door. And what do you think? Spencer looked at her then. Really looked. I think Dad knew exactly who he married. Then he left. Cordelia stood in the doorway for a long moment after the elevator closed. Maggie came beside her. Well, Maggie said that was either progress or the strangest house call I've ever seen. Cordelia looked down at the signed agreement in her hand. One down, she said softly. Maggie's expression sobered. 3 to go. The phone rang just after 7 that evening. Cordelia was alone at the kitchen table. Maggie had gone downstairs to pick up dinner from the little Chinese restaurant Douglas used to love. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint traffic below. The caller ID showed a name Cordelia had not expected. Genevieve Hartwell Knox. Cordelia answered. For a moment there was only breathing on the line. Then Genevieve's voice came through thin and careful. Aunt Cordelia. Cordelia closed her eyes. Aunt. Not Mrs. Hartwell. Not Cordelia. Aunt. Yes, Genevieve. I want to meet with you. Cordelia looked at the stack of documents on the table. Should I call Martin? No, Genevieve said quickly. Then softer. Please, just you. Cordelia said nothing. Genevieve's voice broke. There are things I should have said years ago. The apartment seemed to grow very still. Cordelia looked at Douglas's photograph, then at the empty chair across from her. All right, she said. Come tomorrow morning. After she hung up, Cordelia remained seated for a long time. Spencer had come for money. Genevieve was coming for something else, and Cordelia was not yet sure which would cost more. Genevieve Hartwell Knox arrived the next morning without a driver. That was the first thing Cordelia noticed. No black sedan waiting at the curb. No assistant carrying folders. No tailored coat draped over her shoulders like armor. Genevieve stood alone outside the apartment door wearing dark slacks, a plain cream sweater, and no jewelry except a thin gold wedding band. Her face looked unmade in a way Cordelia had never seen before. Not careless. Human. In her arms she carried an old cardboard box. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The hallway between them seemed to hold all the years they had not known how to cross. Then Genevieve said, "May I come in?" Cordelia stepped aside. The apartment was warm with morning light. Maggie was in the kitchen pretending not to watch, too obviously, while making tea she had already made twice. The table had been cleared except for Cordelia's notebook, a folder from Ellsworth and Douglas's photograph. Genevieve saw the photograph and stopped. It was not the official portrait, not the one from magazine covers or company brochures. It was Douglas in the apartment kitchen, sleeves rolled up, laughing at something just outside the frame. Genevieve's face broke a little. "I've never seen that one." Cordelia looked at the photograph. "He hated formal pictures." Genevieve laughed softly, though there was no joy in it. "He hated ties, too." "Yes." The small, shared memory sat between them like a fragile bridge. Genevieve placed the cardboard box on the table. "I brought something." Maggie appeared in the kitchen doorway. "If it's a lawsuit, I'm pouring the tea on it." Genevieve blinked. Cordelia said, "Maggie." Maggie lifted the teapot. "What, I'm just clarifying rules of hospitality." For the first time that morning, Genevieve almost smiled. "It's not a lawsuit." She opened the box. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Some still in envelopes. Some tied with faded ribbon. Some folded and refolded so many times the creases had softened into the paper. Cordelia recognized the handwriting immediately. Douglas. Not the formal signature from contracts. Not the bold, clean stroke from board documents. The private hand. The one from grocery notes, birthday cards, and the little messages he used to leave beside her coffee. Genevieve touched the top letter. "Dad wrote these when I was in college." Cordelia looked at her. "I didn't know." No one did. Genevieve swallowed. "I never showed anyone, not Meredith, not Bradford, not even my husband." She took one envelope out and held it carefully. "I used to read them when I felt like I had no idea who I was supposed to become." Cordelia sat down slowly. Genevieve remained standing for another moment, then took the chair across from her. Maggie brought tea and set it down without commentary. That was her mercy. Genevieve opened the first letter. The paper was yellowing at the edges. She did not read all of it, only the parts that mattered. "Jenny," she began, and her voice caught on the old nickname. "You asked me whether I will be disappointed if you do not become a lawyer like Meredith. The answer is no. I will be disappointed only if you become someone you do not respect." Cordelia lowered her eyes. Genevieve continued, "Work is not punishment. It is how a person learns the shape of their own hands. Your siblings think wealth is freedom from work. I hope you learn that real freedom is finding work you do not need to lie about." Maggie, standing by the stove, went very still. Genevieve turned to another letter. This one was after I told him I wanted to leave business school. She looked down. "I didn't. Meredith talked me out of it." Then she read, "If you are afraid, tell me you are afraid. Do not dress fear as duty. Duty is what you choose after fear has told the truth." Genevieve stopped. Her fingers tightened on the page. "I was always afraid," she said. Cordelia waited. Genevieve looked at her then. Meredith was so certain. About everything. Bradford was loud. Spencer escaped. And She shook her head. "I learned to disappear while staying in the room." Cordelia knew something about that. Not the same way, but close enough. Genevieve opened another letter. This one had been written after Douglas married Cordelia. "My children may struggle with," Cordelia Douglas had written. "Grief makes people territorial. So does privilege. But I want you to watch how she treats people who cannot help her. That will tell you more about her than anything your sister says." Genevieve's tears fell before she could stop them. "I watched," she whispered. Cordelia's throat tightened. Genevieve wiped her face quickly, almost angrily. "I watched you bring Dad his medication without making him feel weak. I watched you remember the housekeeper's grandson's name. I watched you sit through dinners where Meredith humiliated you and still ask her if she wanted coffee." Maggie muttered, "I told her not to." Cordelia gave a small, sad smile. Genevieve continued, "I knew she was wrong. I knew Bradford was wrong. I knew Spencer was using everyone. And I said nothing." The room quieted. Outside, traffic moved faintly below the window. Inside, the old letters seemed to fill the apartment with a version of Douglas none of them had fully owned. Genevieve placed both hands flat on the table. "I'm sorry, Aunt Cordelia." The words were simple. No performance. No legal qualification. No excuse. Cordelia looked at her for a long moment. There had been a time when that apology would have broken something open in her. But now, after the funeral, after Douglas's letter, after 7 days of learning the shape of power she had never asked for, Cordelia understood something. Apologies did not erase silence, but they could end it. "Genevieve," she said, "silence is not the same as cruelty." Genevieve shook her head. "It still helped cruelty." "Yes," Cordelia said. Genevieve flinched. Cordelia reached across the table and took her hand. "But you are here now." Genevieve began to cry harder then. Quietly, like someone ashamed of making noise. Maggie turned back to the stove and gave them the dignity of not being watched. Cordelia held Genevieve's hand until the younger woman could breathe again. Then she said, "Do you want to help me?" Genevieve looked up. "With what?" "With what your father asked me to protect." Genevieve stared at her. Cordelia released her hand and opened the folder Ellsworth had left the day before. "I do not want to destroy this family. I do not want to spend the rest of my life in court with Douglas's children. But I also cannot let Meredith and Bradford continue as though nothing happened." Genevieve's face changed at their names. Cordelia saw fear return, but it did not take over. "What do you need?" Genevieve asked. "I need someone who understands them." Genevieve gave a humorless laugh. "That may be the worst qualification I have. It may be the most useful." Cordelia slid the folder toward her. "Meredith will not come if I ask. Bradford will come only if he thinks he can win. Spencer has already made his choice." Genevieve looked up sharply. "Spencer came yesterday, and he sold his share." Genevieve sat back. For a moment, she looked stunned, then almost relieved. "That sounds like Spencer." "It also means the family is already changing whether Meredith accepts it or not." Genevieve looked at the folder. "What are you offering?" "A meeting, here. No press, no boardroom, no performance, just the people Douglas loved and the choices they still have." Genevieve was quiet. Cordelia continued, "I will not give control back to Meredith. I will not pretend Bradford's withdrawals were responsible management, but I am willing to give them a path that does not require humiliation." Genevieve looked toward Douglas's photograph. "He knew you would do that." Cordelia followed her gaze. "Maybe." "No," Genevieve said softly. "He did." For a while they sat in silence. Then Genevieve pulled out her phone. Her hand shook slightly. Maggie turned around. "Need moral support?" Genevieve looked at her. "Maybe." Maggie walked over and placed a cup of tea beside her. "Drink first, then call the dragon." Despite everything, Genevieve laughed. "It was brief, but real." She took one sip. Then she called Meredith. Cordelia heard the phone ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Then Meredith answered. "What?" Genevieve closed her eyes. "Meredith, we need to talk. I have nothing to say to you." "You do," Genevieve said. "And you need to say it before the attorneys say everything for us." A pause. Meredith's voice sharpened. "Are you with her?" Genevieve looked at Cordelia, then at the letters. "I'm at Aunt Cordelia's apartment." The silence on the line was cold enough to enter the room. Meredith said, "Of course you are. Please come here. Number." Meredith. "I am not walking into that woman's apartment to be lectured by a nurse and a coward." Genevieve closed her eyes again. For a moment, Cordelia thought fear would win. Then Genevieve opened them. "Dad called her his wife," she said. You can keep calling her whatever you want. But he already answered you. Maggie's eyebrows rose. Cordelia sat very still. On the phone, Meredith said nothing. Genevieve pressed on. Come tomorrow morning. Just you. No Bradford, no lawyers. If you want to fight after that, fight. But look at her once before you do. There was a long pause. Then Meredith said Bradford will not come. That's fine. And I promise nothing. I know. Another pause. Then 10 o'clock. The call ended. Genevieve lowered the phone slowly. Her face was pale. Maggie set both hands on her hips. Well, she said I did not expect that to work. Genevieve let out a breath that was almost a sob. Neither did I. Cordelia looked at Douglas's letters spread across the table. The apartment that had once been their refuge had become something else now. Not a battlefield. Not yet a place of peace. Something in between. A room where the truth had been invited to sit down before the war began. Tomorrow Meredith would come, not with Bradford, not with lawyers, not with promises, but she would come. And Cordelia knew the next conversation would decide whether Douglas's family could still be repaired, or whether it would finally break completely. Meredith arrived at 10 o'clock the next morning, alone. That was the first victory. Not because Cordelia wanted to isolate her, because Meredith Hartwell Crane had spent her entire adult life entering rooms with protection around her lawyers, assistants, siblings, board members, money family name. She knew how to command a conference table. She knew how to turn a room into a courtroom and a conversation into a strategy. But she did not know how to enter Cordelia's apartment. She stood in the doorway wearing a dark coat and a guarded expression, one hand resting on the strap of her leather bag. Her makeup was perfect, but something underneath it had changed since the funeral. The arrogance was still there, but it was no longer effortless. Genevieve stood behind Cordelia near the kitchen table. Maggie had made tea, and then with great reluctance agreed to remain in the kitchen instead of hovering directly over Meredith like a storm cloud. Cordelia opened the door fully. Come in, Meredith. Meredith stepped inside. Her eyes moved through the apartment quickly. The small living room, the worn sofa, the old blue armchair where Douglas had once fallen asleep, the framed photograph of him in the kitchen, the tea tray, the absence of marble, the absence of staff, the absence of anything Meredith could call a throne. That was why Cordelia had chosen this place. Not the Hartwell boardroom, not a lawyer's office, not the estate. Here power had no chandelier. Here control did not come from the height of a chair or the length of a table. Here Douglas had laughed, rested, recovered, and loved. Meredith looked at the photograph longer than she intended to. Cordelia noticed. She did not comment. Sit down, Cordelia said. Meredith sat on the edge of the sofa as if the fabric might accuse her. Genevieve took the chair beside Cordelia, not quite behind her this time. Beside her. That mattered. On the coffee table sat one folder. Thin. Neat. Not enough paper to scare anyone who had spent decades around contracts, but enough to change the future of a company. Cordelia poured tea. Meredith did not touch hers. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Cordelia began. I know you hate me. Meredith's eyes lifted. Cordelia continued before she could answer. I know you believe I came into your father's life and took something that belonged to you. I know you called me a nurse, a mistake, a temporary woman, and worse things when you thought I could not hear. Meredith's mouth tightened. Genevieve looked down. Cordelia's voice remained even. I am not here to argue with that version of me. You have lived with her for 22 years. I cannot remove her from your mind in one morning. Meredith said nothing. Cordelia touched the folder. I am here because your father left me a responsibility. Not a prize, not revenge, a responsibility. Meredith gave a small, bitter laugh. You have controlling interest in a $280 million company. Forgive me if responsibility sounds more poetic than accurate. Cordelia nodded once. That is fair. The answer unsettled Meredith more than resistance would have. Cordelia opened the folder. Your father knew I was not a developer. He knew I had never negotiated a commercial loan or managed construction permits or sat across from investors who wanted more than they deserved. He did not give me this trust because he thought I knew your world. Then why did he? Because he thought I would not sell it just to prove I could. The room quieted. Meredith looked away first. Cordelia slid the first page across the table. I am offering terms. Meredith did not touch the paper. You expect me to sign something in this apartment? No, Cordelia said. I expect you to read before you refuse. Genevieve's mouth moved slightly, almost a smile. Meredith picked up the page. Her eyes moved quickly, then slowed. Cordelia watched her read. Term 1. Meredith would remain CEO of Hartwell Properties, but not alone. A newly appointed oversight board would be formed within 30 days. 2 independent directors selected through the Cordelia Trust. 1 ethics and compliance seat recommended by outside counsel. Quarterly review of executive decisions. No major acquisition, sale, merger, asset transfer, or leveraged financing without trust approval. Meredith looked up. You're putting me on a leash! Cordelia said no. Your father already did. I'm choosing not to remove you from the company. Meredith's jaw shifted. You could. Yes. Then why don't you? Cordelia did not answer yet. She turned to the next page. Bradford will be removed as chief financial officer. That landed. Meredith's expression sharpened. He won't accept that. He does not have to accept it. The board will. He'll sue. He may? Then you're inviting war. No, Cordelia said. I'm ending one kind before it becomes another. She tapped the page. An independent audit will review all management fees, related party expenses, dividend irregularities, and executive withdrawals over the past 10 years. If the audit finds no misconduct, Bradford may be offered another role, not financial control. Meredith stared at the clause. For the first time, she did not defend him. That told Cordelia enough. Genevieve looked at her sister, perhaps noticing the same thing. Cordelia moved to the 3rd term. Genevieve will be offered the role of chief people officer. Genevieve's head lifted sharply. What? Meredith turned. Absolutely not. Cordelia looked at Genevieve. You have spent your life watching this family from the place people forgot to guard. You understand fear. You understand silence. You understand what happens when good people stop speaking because louder people make the room unsafe. Genevieve's eyes filled. Cordelia continued. A company is not only buildings and numbers, it is people deciding every day whether they are safe enough to tell the truth. Douglas knew that. I think you know it too. Genevieve covered her mouth with one hand. Meredith looked between them. You discussed this? No, Genevieve whispered. Cordelia said I am discussing it now. Meredith leaned back, stunned by the simple fact that a decision had been made in front of her without her permission. Cordelia turned the final page. The Cordelia Trust will retain veto power over any sale of Hartwell properties for 25 years. Meredith's face hardened immediately. There it is. Yes, Cordelia said. You want control. I want protection. You want to trap the company. I want to stop it from being sold by people who see it only as an exit. Meredith stood. I knew this was a performance. Genevieve rose halfway. Meredith. No. Meredith's voice cracked, but anger covered it quickly. She sits here in this little apartment with tea and old photographs pretending she's gentle while she dismantles everything we built. Cordelia looked at her carefully. Meredith froze. Cordelia's voice stayed quiet. What did you build, Meredith? The question was not cruel. That made it worse. Meredith opened her mouth. No answer came quickly enough. Cordelia stood then, not dramatically. Slowly, because she was 67 and grief had made her tired. But when she stood, Meredith did not look taller. Your father did not say you were useless, Cordelia said. He said you were brilliant without mercy. That is not the same thing. Meredith's eyes flashed. Do not quote my father to me. I am not quoting him. I am honoring him. The room went silent. Cordelia took one step closer. Douglas believed you were capable. If he had not, he would have removed you completely. He did not. He left a structure that would stop you from destroying the company, but he did not erase you from it. Meredith's face changed, just slightly. Cordelia saw the opening, not weakness, a wound. "Why are you not firing me?" Meredith asked. The question came out smaller than she intended. Cordelia answered honestly. "Because your father did not." Meredith looked away. Cordelia continued. "He was disappointed in you, deeply. But disappointment is not the same as giving up. He gave you a boundary because he still hoped you might learn what power is for." Meredith's lips parted. For a second she looked like a girl hearing her father close a door. Cordelia's voice softened but did not lose strength. "I do not trust you with unchecked control. I will not pretend otherwise. But I believe you know this company better than anyone in your generation. I believe your intelligence can serve something better than your pride. And I believe Douglas would want you given one chance to prove his worst fears about you wrong." Meredith sat down, not gracefully, as if her body had forgotten what posture was supposed to mean. She covered her face with one hand. Genevieve looked at Cordelia, startled. Maggie had gone completely still in the kitchen. For the first time in 22 years, Meredith Hartwell Crane cried in front of Cordelia. Not beautifully, not softly. The tears came like something torn out of her. She tried to stop them. Of course she did. She pressed her fingers to her eyes, turned her face away, swallowed hard, rebuilt the mass piece by piece, and failed each time. Cordelia did not go to comfort her. That mattered too. She did not owe Meredith an easy forgiveness. She did not kneel beside her. She did not stroke her hair. She allowed Meredith the dignity and discomfort of facing herself without being rescued from it. After a long moment, Meredith lowered her hand. Her voice was rough. "I hated that he loved you after my mother." Cordelia closed her eyes briefly. There it was. Not all of it. But the root? Meredith looked at Douglas's photograph. "I thought if he loved you, it meant we had been replaced." Cordelia said, "Love is not a chair at a table, Meredith. Someone else sitting down does not make you disappear." Meredith laughed once through tears. A broken sound. "You say that like someone who was seated in the last row." Cordelia almost smiled. "I was." Genevieve let out a breath that was nearly a sob. Meredith wiped her face. "What happens to Bradford? He gets audited, and if he stole, then he answers for it." Meredith nodded slowly. No defense this time. "What happens to Spencer?" "He sold his share." Meredith's eyes widened. "Of course he did." There was almost affection in her exhaustion. Almost. Cordelia placed the pen beside the agreement. "You do not have to sign today. You may take it to council." Meredith stared at the pen. "If I take it to council, I'll turn it back into a war." "Yes. And you know that." "Yes." Meredith looked at Genevieve. "You're staying with her." Genevieve answered carefully. "I'm standing where I should have stood sooner." Meredith absorbed that. Then she picked up the pen. Her hand trembled. For a moment, Cordelia thought she would put it down. Instead, Meredith signed. Her signature was controlled at first, then faltered slightly near the end. Meredith Hartwell Crane. CAO. Daughter. Not forgiven. Not condemned. Found. When she finished, she set the pen down and did not immediately release it. "I'm sorry," she said. The words were so low, Cordelia almost missed them. Genevieve began to cry quietly. Meredith looked up at Cordelia. "I do not know how to mean it well yet," she said, "but I know I should have said it before he died." Cordelia looked at her for a long time. Then she nodded. "I know." Meredith waited. Perhaps for more? Perhaps for absolution. Cordelia did not give it. Instead, she said, "Then start by meaning the next thing you do." Meredith accepted that. A few minutes later, she stood to leave. At the door, she paused beside Douglas's photograph. For a moment, her fingers hovered near the frame. She did not touch it, but she looked at it. Really looked. Then she walked out. The apartment door closed softly behind her. Genevieve sat down as though her knees had gone weak. Maggie emerged from the kitchen with the teapot. "Well," she said, voice thick, that was either the most uncomfortable peace treaty in American corporate history, or we need stronger tea. Cordelia sat back down. For the first time since the funeral, the apartment felt less like a temporary headquarters and more like a place where something broken had been set carefully on the table. Not fixed, not yet, but no longer hidden. Then Cordelia looked at the unsigned clause marked Bradford Hartwell Financial Review. The room's quiet shifted. Because Meredith had signed, Spencer had left. Genevieve had chosen, but Bradford had not come. And somewhere across the city, the one child who had treated Hartwell properties like a private bank still believed numbers could hide longer than truth. 6 months later, Hartwell Properties still stood. That surprised people. After the funeral, after the letter, after the trust documents, after the quiet meeting in Cordelia's apartment, the city expected a collapse. There were whispers that the company would fracture, that Meredith Hartwell Crane would be forced out, that Bradford would sue, that Cordelia would sell everything and disappear into wealth the family had always accused her of wanting. None of that happened. Instead, Hartwell Properties changed in the way old buildings change when the foundation is repaired. Not all at once, not loudly, but permanently. The new board structure was approved before the end of the month. 2 independent directors joined the company. A financial oversight committee was formed. Major decisions now required review through the Cordelia Trust. Meredith remained CEO. At first, people called it weakness. They said Cordelia had been too forgiving. They said Douglas had handed her power, and she had failed to use it harshly enough. But inside the company, something different was happening. Meredith worked harder than anyone had seen her work in years. She arrived early. She stayed late. She listened before speaking, not always, but more often than before. In board meetings, she still had the sharpest mind in the room. She still corrected errors before others saw them. She still frightened junior executives with a single raised eyebrow. But now there was a pause before the cut, a moment when she seemed to ask herself whether being right was the same as being useful. No one knew whether she was trying to prove Cordelia wrong for sparing her, or prove Cordelia right. Maybe both. Genevieve became chief people officer in the spring. The title sounded corporate enough to satisfy the board, but she treated it like something more serious than a title. She met with department heads, she spoke to assistants, site managers, building staff, leasing agents, and maintenance workers who had never been asked what the company looked like from where they stood. Within 3 months, employee turnover dropped. Within 4, Hartwell Properties created its first internal apprenticeship program. Genevieve brought the proposal to Cordelia personally, not because she needed permission for every detail, because she wanted Cordelia to see it first. They reviewed it at the small kitchen table in the apartment, the same table where the trust documents had once been spread like battlefield maps. Maggie made tea. Genevieve made notes. Cordelia listened. Somewhere along the way, the visits stopped feeling official. Every Thursday afternoon, Genevieve came by. At first, she brought folders, then letters, then stories. Eventually, she brought only herself. They drank tea by the window and talked about Douglas. Not the man Meredith fought with. Not the father Bradford disappointed. Not the tycoon the city admired. But Douglas in the apartment. Douglas burning toast. Douglas pretending not to nap. Douglas leaving notes on napkins because he forgot where he put the good stationery. One afternoon, Genevieve laughed so hard at a story about Douglas trying to fix a leaking sink that she had to wipe her eyes. Cordelia laughed too, and for the first time the laughter did not feel borrowed from grief. Bradford left the company. The audit found what everyone expected and what no one wanted to say: plainly inflated management fees, personal expenses routed through company accounts, payments disguised as consulting costs, years of treating Hartwell Properties like a private account with a logo. There were consequences. Not prison. Not public ruin. Cordelia did not want the family name dragged through every financial headline in the city. But Bradford was removed from every financial role required to repay what independent auditors could clearly document and barred from holding executive authority in any Hartwell entity. He did not apologize. Cordelia had not expected him to. He opened a small property management business in another part of the city, a modest office, 4 employees, no family name on the door at first. For the first time in his life, Bradford had to convince clients who did not care who his father had been. Each month a check arrived at the Douglas Hartwell Foundation. Not large, not generous enough to be mistaken for transformation, but regular. The first time Cordelia saw one, she held it for a long moment. Maggie looked over her shoulder. Is that from Bradford? Yes. Did he write a note? Number? Of course not. Cordelia placed the check in the foundation folder. He sent it. Maggie softened. I suppose that is something. Yes, Cordelia said, it is. Spencer vanished from the city 3 weeks after signing over his share. There were rumors. A villa in Portugal, a sailboat in Florida, a retreat in Montana, a woman in Buenos Aires. No one knew which story was true. Cordelia hoped none of them were entirely true, and all of them were enough to keep him from returning broke and angry. Once months later, a postcard arrived with no return address. It showed a coastline somewhere warm. On the back, in Spencer's loose handwriting, were 6 words. Tell her I didn't waste all of it. There was no name. Cordelia knew who her was. She put the postcard in a drawer beside Douglas's letters. Not because it healed anything, because it belonged to the unfinished parts of the family. The Douglas Hartwell Foundation began quietly. Cordelia did not want a gala. Meredith suggested one. Cordelia declined. Bradford would have suggested sponsorship tiers. He was no longer invited to suggest things. The foundation's first project funded housing support for retired nurses and hospital workers who had spent their lives caring for people but could not afford to retire with dignity. Douglas would have liked that. Cordelia knew he would. At the first small luncheon held in a community center instead of a hotel ballroom, Meredith stood near the back of the room while Cordelia spoke. Cordelia did not speak long. She had never liked microphones. She said only that Douglas believed buildings mattered because people needed places to become themselves. Then she added, after a pause, and he believed the people who care for others should not be forgotten when they need care themselves. Meredith looked down at that. Not in shame exactly, in recognition. That evening, Cordelia visited Douglas's grave alone. Autumn had returned by then. The cemetery was quiet, lined with old trees whose leaves had turned bronze and gold. The Hartwell family plot sat on a gentle slope overlooking the city Douglas had helped build. For many years, Cordelia had wondered where she belonged in places like this. At family tables, in photographs, in chapel pews, beside a name carved in stone. Now she walked to Douglas's grave without asking anyone's permission. She carried white flowers, not lilies this time, gardenias, the flowers he used to buy from a corner shop because he could never remember whether they were too much and bought them anyway. She placed them gently against the headstone. Douglas Hartwell, builder, father, husband. Cordelia touched the final word, husband. For a long time she said nothing. Then she sat on the stone bench beside the grave. The wind moved through the trees, lifting a few fallen leaves and setting them down again. I did it, she said softly. Her voice did not break. Not this time. Not perfectly, not cleanly, not the way you probably imagined. She smiled faintly. Though knowing you imagined at least 5 possible outcomes and made Martin prepare for all of them. The cemetery remained quiet. Cordelia folded her hands in her lap. Meredith is trying. Genevieve is becoming herself. Spencer is somewhere warm, I think. Bradford. She exhaled. Bradford sends checks. I am choosing to count that as a beginning, not an ending. A leaf fell onto the edge of the headstone. Cordelia brushed it away. I was angry with you for not telling me, she admitted. For a while. I thought you had left me to discover my own life in public. She looked toward the city. But you knew me. You knew I would have tried to fix everyone before I protected myself. You knew I would have carried the secret like a duty instead of living beside you freely. Her eyes filled then, but the tears were gentle. You gave me 22 years without that burden. I understand now. From her coat pocket, she removed the final page of Douglas's letter, the copy Martin Ellsworth had made for her. The paper was folded carefully. She opened it and read the last lines again, not aloud at first. Then quietly, as the wind moved through the trees, Douglas's words seemed to answer her. I do not want to be remembered as a tycoon. I want to be remembered as a man who loved a good woman and did what he could to protect her. Cordelia, thank you for staying beside me. Now live. That is the last gift I can give you. Cordelia folded the page. A petal from one of the gardenias loosened in the wind and landed against Douglas's name. For a moment she simply watched it there. Then she smiled. Not because everything had been repaired. Some things would always remain cracked. Meredith's apology was still new. Bradford's silence still had weight. Spencer's absence still left unanswered questions. Genevieve's friendship was still learning how to stand. But the family no longer lived inside a lie. And Cordelia no longer lived in the last row. She rose slowly from the bench. Her knees ached. Her heart did too, but neither pain owned her. Before leaving, she touched the headstone once more. "I'll live," she whispered, "for both of us." Then Cordelia Hartwell turned toward the path toward the city, toward the small apartment where tea would be waiting, and where Thursday would bring Genevieve to the door again. Behind her, the wind moved softly through the trees. Ahead of her, life waited. Not as a reward, as a legacy.